Hi, I'm Tesa Arcilla. In Choices and Chances, I use my own style of interviewing, honed through decades as an international news presenter and correspondent, to delve into a new topic each week and interview some of the most inspiring people in the world. Life is a series of choices, choices that give us chances to live our best lives. My goal is to turn the wisdom of people I talk to and lessons from my own experiences into ideas you can use. So if you'd like to be inspired by other stories, hit the subscribe button and join the community.
So Helena, thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm a little bit nervous to be sitting on the other side,
I
Tessa.
know. It's always strange, isn't it? Look, we've known each other a while. We've known each other through work. But because we met during COVID, I think it's so interesting that there's still a lot about you, I think, that will be new to me. You've got a really diverse background. You've lived in a few different places. You're multilingual. You love languages, and you're a journalist. And we know that in this line of work, it's just an exposure to so many cultures, people from different walks of life. How would you characterize your identity right now? Who are you?
That's a tough question. You know, when people say, where are you from? Or you have that moment when you go to a party and someone asks, you know, where did you grow up? I dread that question. I think a lot of people do these days if they've kind of lived lots of different places. I grew up all across Europe, and then I went to university in the UK. But then as soon as I left university, I moved back to France, and then ended up in Switzerland, and then ended up in Asia, West Africa, until I was here in the US right now. So I always say that when I'm in London, I feel like a kind of a fake Londoner. You know, and here in the US, obviously people think that I'm really British, particularly now I'm working with the BBC. But you know, I think I'm a journalist specialised in foreign affairs, and as you say, sort of always been really curious and passionate about different languages. Nosy, I think, probably. So, kind of to sum myself up, you know, kind of an international journalist specialized in foreign affairs. I think it's a bit of a cliche to say a nomad today. I think everyone says it, you know, digital nomad. But certainly a bit of a rolling stone, I think.
Yeah, and I love languages as well, and I think it opens up a lot from a mental, cognitive empathy point of view. What do these languages, and what does your knowledge of these languages do for you? How does it make you think differently, if you will, if it does?
You know, people come at languages in different ways, I think. You know, some people come, I really admire grammarians, people who come at languages in this way because they love syntax and kind of this mathematical way of working it all out. My teachers will tell you I'm definitely not that person. You know, I kind of like accents and words, and just having, even if you're not great at a language, a few words to kind of open up a conversation, to get a conversation started. I think it's a way of, as you say, forging that connection, having that empathy. You know, sometimes, you know, Tessa, you'll know this from your work, with a terror attack, something like that, something terrible. If you're asking someone to tell you their story on one of the worst days of their life, and you can come in, you don't have to conduct the interview in, you know, whatever language it is, but if you can even just start and you make that bridge in someone else's language, I think you show that you're kind of willing to be at that level. And so for me, I've come to journalism, I think, from a point of view of loving people and wanting to having these conversations. So that's kind of my drive. How can I have more conversations with more people around the world, I think.
And you keep going back to the fact that you're a journalist, and I understand that completely when someone says, "Who are you?" and I say, "I'm a journalist." And
Right.
yeah, going back to that identity, do you ever have that fear of, if one day I stop being a journalist, who am I? Am I less interesting? Do you ever have that fear?
All the time. That we have that conversation all the time at home, because my husband's a journalist as well. And I was watching a reel on Instagram, as you do, where you find out all these kind of life moments, right, that start these conversations. And it was about a ballet dancer and somebody who said, you know, I worked my whole life for this and I'm not a ballet dancer anymore. Who am I? And something just really resonated. And I said, that's the same thing that we have with journalism, because these are kind of very similar vocational things. If you do something because you love it so much, the thought of being away from it is really difficult. But I think you've got to think as well about what it is that you love about that, right? Like, nothing says that you can't dance if you're not a ballet dancer. And I sometimes think, because of how volatile this industry is, okay, you expect to be made redundant multiple times, I think. What first attracted you to it, right? So for me, it was writing and those human connections. And that's the beauty of writing, right? You can always write, even if you're not a journalist or whatever. It's so applicable to so many things. So that's the one thing that kind of carries me through. I think, okay, let's see where this goes. But we always have those things, words and languages and writing in my case. So that's really important to me.
You haven't always been a journalist either. So you started off in humanitarian work. Tell us a little bit about that and how you moved from that to journalism.
Yeah, that's right. I was living in Geneva. I used to present a breakfast radio show, which was great, for 3 years as a radio journalist in the morning. And obviously Switzerland's, it's more quiet than, say, if you're living in New York or London or whatever. But what Geneva really has is, all this access to the humanitarian world. And so often you'll find yourself down reporting at the Palais des Nations on, particularly at that time, the Arab Spring, and you go to all these briefings. And I started to think, these stories are really what I want to be covering. And of course, at that time, it was often the guys that were getting sent out on these kind of stories, right? No matter how many times you put your hand up and say, I really want to do this. And so a job came up at the UN. Our radio station closed down. And I thought, this is an opportunity to sort of get that access and get that experience. And so I joined the UN. Ebola happened pretty quickly afterwards. I remember I was sent down to the meeting because they said, oh, well, you're a journalist, you can take these notes. And, I heard about Ebola for the first time and I thought, God, that sounds awful. I kind of Googled in the lift a hemorrhagic fever and I didn't really know what it was. Basically, I ended up kind of then having a career with the UN and Red Cross in West Africa and Asia, mainly focused on the Ebola outbreak as a spokesperson based there. And it was fascinating. It was deeply rewarding work, but that itch of journalism kept coming back. I think probably I'd left journalism a little bit too early. Some people, when they go into communications work, they're really, really finished with journalism. I don't think I was. I was only 27. And so I ended up getting a call from Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's public broadcaster, and taking up a job there and going back. But I think the things that I learned there, that was probably my biggest period of growth, in my life, of where I learned anything. If you're on the front line of a deadly epidemic and, you're dealing with people in terrible circumstances every day, it was really informative to my work as a journalist, I think. So I'm always really grateful for that work. And I sometimes still, I hanker after it a little bit. Sometimes, you sort of think that was kind of really, compared to what we do in journalism, you're really living the story. It's your life and you kind of really get to grips with it. And I do miss that sometimes, especially when I'm here in DC, and the news that we're covering is kind of Capitol Hill and lawmakers and last minute votes and so on,
Yeah, and I imagine that with humanitarian work, you are directly impacting their lives through the work that you do. So that feels like a huge responsibility. You were in your early 20s, and I saw that you were also you were a spokesperson for one of the agencies, right? You were very young, big responsibility. Did you ever think, what on earth am I doing being the spokesperson of this huge agency, responsible for the lives of a lot of people in some ways?
It was so stressful. I remember one time we had a volunteer with the Red Cross who was the first Red Cross volunteer to be infected with Ebola. And we were so worried about him because he went into a coma for 40 days and no one had come out the other side of a coma from Ebola for 40 days. And I remember thinking, not only am I going to have to kind of break this to the world, if the worst happens, that we'd lost a volunteer, just that kind of responsibility. And because I was a journalist before, how everything, the questions that are going to come from news anchors and correspondents. And yeah, there were definitely moments then when you just really felt like you were going to be in the firing line. I have to say, most of the time, whenever I did those kind of interviews, people were just really concerned about, the humanitarian situation on the ground, because the images were so devastating coming out of there. People did want to know people's human stories. But the longer that outbreak went on, of course, there were kind of questions about how something was handled and so on. So it was really nerve-wracking. And what I felt leaving that situation, and now as I've kind of read more about it, is I had tremendous guilt because I could leave, and people I worked with, a lot of them were volunteers. So they were kind of putting their own lives in danger to help others in the epidemic, which was incredible. And, I sort of asked questions, would people have done the same in the UK if there was, this deadly disease, and of course we saw COVID years later. But yeah, the ability of being able to leave a situation, and I know a lot of foreign correspondents talk about that as well, is a huge privilege. And you think about that a lot, I think, when you leave somewhere like that, right? Like the luxury of being able to leave.
It is a very strange feeling. And I think here's some insight into journalists. What we do on the field is that sometimes, even when we're covering war, we do get to stay at maybe a hotel, or this is what happens at the back end,
Right.
right? And I understand that guilt. Yeah, we can leave, and at the end of the day, you think, so what did I do? What have I helped? I think some journalists do ask that question. It's a strange feeling. I don't really know what to make of it at this point. I don't know. Do you know how to interpret that guilt, that feeling?
I think from kind of courses I've been to about kind of hostile environment training afterwards, which I've gone to, and I'm not saying at all that's PTSD, but there are kind of stages along that road where you might feel frustration, you might feel, you can feel that your life when you go back to your world, you can feel it's quite futile and meaningless. I remember going to a party a few weeks later for a friend, and it just felt kind of over the top and frivolous, and you compare it to the lives of other people, and all of those things I think are actually stages of how you're processing what you saw, right? So I think that's probably what it is. But yeah, the questions of like, did you improve the situation and so on as well, I think are things that you grapple with as well, and in journalism as well, kind of, especially if you parachute into a situation.
Earlier you mentioned your husband, and I know him, Carl, is also a journalist. I always found that interesting because you're one of the few that I know who would go head to head on the same job, because you're both correspondents,
Yes.
you're both presenters. What is that like?
Well, I'm really lucky. Carl is very supportive in that regard, and we met through work. So I think meeting through work means that you've seen each other, and I knew Carl for years before we were even dating. So I'd always really admired his work. He says that he'd admired my work. Whatever he thought about it, I don't really know. But, so I think that there was that professional respect there before, and we'd worked on a story before, and I thought he was just very talented. So I think we've always kind of really encouraged each other and said, I want to see you thrive in that. But of course, the other aspect of it is sort of making sure that you don't take work home all the time, right? That you're not always having conversations about work. And sometimes it's a case of having to say, we are just not talking about the news. Recently we were in Jamaica for 11 days, which was incredible. And I purposely did not interact with the news at all. And I think that was really, really healthy. But yeah, of course there's competition, and we've gone up for the same jobs up against each other as well. But up until now, it's worked out.
Yeah, that's good. And I think something we all went through was during COVID, because we were all trying to get jobs at the time. I think just for background, so we all got to know each other through this big project by big American networks. It was NBC at the time. It's in the news. There was this big channel. So for a lot of us, it was our dream gig, right? And then COVID hit.
It was.
And then the channel just didn't continue. And that was a tough period. Tell us what that was like.
Yeah, because obviously that meant two people being made redundant right at the same time during COVID. It was a really tough couple of years. The UK also went through a really tough time as well. So it was a lot of hustle, a lot of freelance hustle, just keeping your hand in the game, trying to keep your spirits up, wondering if a career pivot might be on the cards. It didn't turn out that way, but I also sort of think that's also like when you're so focused on journalism, you think, well, what else am I going to do? You know, so emotionally, it was a huge challenge. Although I have to say, I think when we came out the other side of it, I personally felt a little bit different. I actually felt almost like I had that moment to take a deep breath and go, oh, thank God, you know, like, okay, we've both got jobs again. We've come out the other side. And that's actually when I started to feel some of that kind of negative emotion release, I think, because I'd been holding it together so hard for those couple of years, and just sort of, getting up each morning, applying for jobs, doing the freelance kind of thing and all that hustle. That's when I realized that I was tired, actually. It was sort of like 2 years later. So it's interesting, isn't it? I think how you process emotions, and they don't always come out when you think they will. I don't know if you experience that as well, then kind of coming out the other side of your journey and moving and so on, that there's a moment when you realize like, wow, actually, I am tired.
Yeah. How did that come out for you? What was the manifestation of that feeling of, oh gosh, I'm tired?
Just, where you sort of feel kind of like your bandwidth is fully taken up by, maybe your job. And, I moved continents, moved jobs, had to find a new house, finally had my wedding, which was, I had got married during the pandemic, but then kind of organized a wedding at the same time. And I think I just came out of the other end of that, sort of that month. And I just kind of, you're just done, right? Like you just feel low, and kind of, even though it's meant to be a celebratory moment, you just suddenly realize that you are drained, and you have to kind of take it easy. And in any off time you have, you really have to try and recharge, because it does catch up with you, I think.
Yeah. Did you ever doubt yourself during that time and thought, when you were thinking of the career pivot, you thought, okay, I can't do this, or I won't be able to do this? Were there doubts about your own capability, hireability at the time? I just, when people see you now, they see the success, obviously, on the other side of it. But that was a really tough period for a lot of us.
Yeah. I think speaking for myself, but maybe a lot of other women kind of also identify with this a bit, is that imposter syndrome, or at least a lack of confidence in your own ability, sometimes is pretty normal anyway. So it's not like I hadn't dealt with that before, right? I think definitely starting in journalism, it was a case of fake it till you make it at first. You sort of think like, what am I doing? And so in some ways that wasn't entirely new to me. But yeah, definitely there were sort of times when you just think, during that COVID time, it was such a difficult time for so many people, but if you lose your job during that time, obviously it's incredibly difficult, because you're kind of hitting a bit of a brick wall, aren't you, with kind of emails you send out into the world and so on. And it's so easy for anybody to say, well, let's touch base when this is all over, when we'll see you on the other side. So kind of keeping the faith during that time, I think economic necessity kind of at least was good in motivating me right through that time. But I think even now, I think everybody kind of has moments of wobbles, and you just think, what am I doing? I think the best thing is when you sort of find journalists, or not even just journalists, anybody in your profession who's top of their game, who you really admire, and then you hear that they also kind of went through those crises of confidence. You just think, okay, it's all of us.
Yes.
Nobody knows what.
Yes, it's incredibly tough period. And now here you are on the other side. What were, I suppose, the biggest challenges getting here, or pivotal moments that people might not know about you that really shaped who you are?
I think probably a lot of people will say this, but if you go into journalism and you don't know other journalists, it's quite an intimidating space to first enter into, isn't it? You sort of think, I hadn't met a journalist until I went into journalism, and it does seem kind of like quite a guarded kind of place of, there's a kind of an intellectual elitism, I think, that comes with it. And you feel kind of quite nervous going into it. And I know I certainly felt that. And then, you can add to that kind of challenges with your own confidence, and, you think, am I doing the right thing? And obviously, having people from as many backgrounds as possible in journalism matters so much. It is probably one of the industries where that's one of the most important things in terms of, class barriers, diversity barriers, any of these things, because, we can't get away from our own biases, even if we say that we're trying to be impartial. So I just kind of, encourage people from all backgrounds, never to think that journalism isn't for them. But I know that it's hard, and it can seem pretty austere and prohibitive from the outside. So I think I definitely kind of felt that at first that it might not be the place for me. And then, as you say, there are redundancies in journalism, picking yourself back up, after you've got a shifting kind of media landscape, and just staying on that horse is pretty tough sometimes, I think. I think those are definitely some of the challenges that I've kind of faced. And then I would say as well, I think sometimes if you do want to do lots of different things, there's that feeling, I think, as a woman of, I think it's pretty easy to be put in a box in a certain way and say, well, no, I do want to be in the field, actually. I love being in the studio, but I want to get my hands dirty. And I think you really have to insist and kind of keep knocking on doors, keep sending emails, keep sending pictures. And that's tiring too, right? You only have so much mental energy for that, just to get people to see you in a way that you can operate. But for some reason, someone else thinks that you seem like you should be kind of in the studio, or you seem like, why would you want to kind of go out and kind of get your hands dirty? And you sort of say, well, I think that's quite tough.
Is that the external judgment, whether it's, being a woman, what you look like, what they think, that
Right.
That's what it is, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think it can be pretty tough for women in that regard, right? I think they have to go sort of, push often kind of double as hard to say, actually, I can do all of this, to be seen in their kind of full variety of talents. I think that can be pretty challenging. I think I haven't met a single female journalist who hasn't said that they've also found that challenging.
Yeah, and I think another thing that comes into the picture, being a woman, of course, I remembered having colleagues who have had to play down their role at home just so they don't get not chosen for a deployment, or but it's also really hard to balance. What are your thoughts on that? Because we can't do it all, and we also don't want to miss out on those opportunities. I don't really quite know the answer, because either, I don't know, you do a lot less in the field, or you're really committed. Because I remember 20 years in my career that I was super committed and there's nothing else that I was doing. Is that the only way to do it, or are we missing something?
No, I think we are missing something. I think, I mean, I can't speak from obviously a position of experience, but just in terms of looking at, overarching sociological trends, I think the answer is give more time off to men, make men part of the equation, make sure that society has got adequate childcare. Like, I think there is an answer, and I think that the reason that those answers don't exist is because of kind of patriarchal structures, right? Like, I think there's absolutely no reason that a woman shouldn't be doing kind of any of those things, and should even have to really make that choice. But unfortunately, because of the way that, a lot of particularly, really developed societies are set up, there's just no provision for that whatsoever. I think it's pretty scandalous that, something like the World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for a year, as the recommendation. And at the same time, there's absolutely no provision for, in this country, for example, maternity leave, or, even making it kind of equal, right? So, and then it wouldn't be an issue. I read that recently that in some kind of Scandinavian countries where there's much better kind of distribution of maternity and paternity leave, that it's almost become a little bit of a faux pas if the father isn't taking, the full extent, because, in terms of sharing the load, I thought, like, that was just great.
Yeah, but that's also a societal shift, isn't it?
I'm sure there's a way that we can
No, I
think of
agree.
it, right? To make sure that, I mean, it's just, and when you look at, the shifts that are happening now in society, and, I think a lot of women are thinking, well, I don't know if I can work like I don't have children, and parent like I don't have a job, right? And they're choosing, in some cases, economic well-being, obviously. In many cases, people can't afford to have children. Their mental well-being as well. And I just think that there is probably a way to empower people who do want to do these things, or not, of course. But I just think that there's still a lot to answer for, I think, in terms of why we haven't done that yet. I think it's so frustrating when you see people, fantastic, in our cases, women correspondents who are having to make tough choices. There's just no excuse, I don't think.
Being in DC now, when we're assigned to cover a story that's not our home country, we do need to learn a lot about the nuances of that society. And you're married to an American, so there's different insight there. Is there anything or new insight or new idea that changed in your understanding of American society, just because we have so many of our own ideas about it based on what we read from outside of the US?
I think one of the things I've always found so interesting about America, but also because I'm British, is that, you feel that proximity and you really do feel politically linked. And, when people say, oh, when America sneezes, Britain catches a cold. And I do think that is true still. But I've always found, or at least what I found surprising when I first moved to America, the first time was a few years ago, but was the convening power of religion in this country, in terms of how much space it takes up in the political debate, how much room it has to be part of legislation and laws, and what people want to see happen with Supreme Court decisions, for example. But then on the other hand, and again, I think very different to the UK, is this kind of convening power of religion as well, kind of people practicing their faith, I think, in a way that's more open, using it as kind of a sense of community as well. So it just plays a greater role. And I think that's probably, if you look back at kind of history and how America obviously was founded, with kind of particularly people who left the UK, for example, who'd been faced persecution, religious persecution in the UK as well. It makes sense, but it's interesting to watch it continue to play such a big role.
When we talked about personal bias, I teach this to my students a lot. When personal bias can creep into the way you frame your questions, into what sound bites you choose, etc. How do you keep that in check, and what advice would you give to people to keep that in check?
I think that working at the BBC has been probably one of my most useful years in terms of journalistic growth. And I feel really, really privileged and grateful for that, because obviously impartiality is one of our key tenets of the editorial guidelines. But at the same time, you can never say, well, we practice impartiality, therefore I am completely free of bias. That just doesn't exist. And if you think that, then I guess mistakes will be made, right? But it's been tremendously liberating for me to be able to feel empowered to go into interviews, knowing both sides of a story, and knowing that editorially it's okay to ask with facts for the other side of the story, without feeling like, although it can feel uncomfortable sometimes, that's true, it doesn't mean that you're being an awful journalist, right? It doesn't mean that you're being some kind of probing hack. You are simply doing your job, and you have to kind of put that armor on and make sure that you present the other side. So I think being pretty ruthless and rigorous with myself about that as an exercise, because I'm new in a job at the BBC. I know that it's expected and demanded of me, has been really good, I think, just kind of in terms of checking those, biases, as you say, in terms of your line of questioning. Not kind of having something presumptive in your question either, in terms of how you frame those questions. And so, it's always a work in progress, isn't it? And just kind of making sure that you're completely exposing yourself to as many different, media types and books that you're reading, and just trying to expose yourself, I think, is nourishing. But it's an intellectual exercise, and it's not always easy.
No, it's not. Intellectually, I think there are steps that can be followed, but emotionally, I do want to ask you if you feel that sort of pressure, because depending on your background, your references, the education you've had, the society you live in, there are sometimes painted good guys and bad guys in a story. And when you go out there as a journalist saying, I want to be intellectually independent and just do my job, regardless of what I personally think. But then what if what you find out is against a common narrative that, when you go back home,
Yes.
do you feel that kind of pressure?
I think definitely when I was younger, and I was sort of starting out in journalism, I would feel that. I think you have to be prepared to go into a story not knowing what you're going to find. You have to find the question interesting, but you have to sort of, just as you say, it's such a intellectual exercise to kind of strip away what you think you're going to find into a story. And I really think you have to try and go in as open-minded as possible. It's really, really difficult. And, then come back, report your findings. I think that is pretty hard in terms of like how, emotionally, there is an emotional impact to it. I think it would be remiss to say that it doesn't impact you emotionally. I think, if you have a tough interview with somebody, live on air, and you have to question their narrative or their facts, particularly when it's a really sensitive topic, in that moment, it's not confrontation, but it verges on confrontation. If you're an empathetic person, or just anybody who kind of values that human connection, you see it in someone's eyes, right? I'm sure you've had that moment when you have to ask for proof, or what proof have you got of that, or what would you say to the other side that says this? You see for a moment that flicker in their eyes when they either think they don't like you very much, or they think you're being facetious, but you just have to kind of have that shell in that moment. But I think you do come home and you have to decompress from that, and you have a glass of wine and you think, that was a little bit uncomfortable, but I was just doing my job. But yeah, it does register in the body. I think it has to.
Yes. And also the fact that we live in a world where you can be judged and trolled, and people don't realize you're a human who's trying to do the best that you can do in the job that you're doing. But then, so how do
Yes.
you deal with that? Because depending, especially when covering politics, depending on that interview for that particular day and the person you were talking to, your line of questioning, people would assume just based on that clip, and then you've got the internet trolls. How do you deal with that? That's not part of our lives. We can't just be in a public job and not have that other side of being in a public sphere. So what do you do?
And it's such a growing part of our job as well, right? Like, it wasn't even to this extent sort of 10 years ago, or when you might have made the choice to go into that profession. So, just having a thick skin, I don't think, is probably the answer. I think you have to know when to interact with it. Certainly, I decide when you want to look at those comments. Not that you never interact with them, because I think it's important probably to look at those things. There are days when maybe you didn't do such a good job. It's okay to see that feedback too. But I think it's like, do I feel in the mindset to interact with that? That's generally what I ask myself with that kind of stuff. Is today the day that I need this strange troll on the internet's comment about how he thought my body looked when I stood in that studio? I'm like, no, today I don't need it, and I'm not going to look at that today. So I think it's about choosing your moments for that kind of stuff. And as you say, with stuff that can be seen as, if you're entrenched on one side and you're going to absolutely hate that clip that was taken on the other side, just knowing you are never going to please everybody, right? And generally in life, that's the thing. A couple of things I think about: you're never going to please everybody in life, so people are going to say things they don't like about you, so just don't interact with that. And also be careful whose opinion you take of you, right? If you wouldn't take advice from that person, then if they don't like you, is it a huge issue? That's kind of something that I think of too sometimes.
Were you always this confident when it comes to that? It's great.
I don't think I probably am that confident about it, but that's what I tell my other friends in this profession when they get upset about those kind of things. And I guess you just, you look at the kind of mess on social media right now and all of these things, and you just think people are always going to say something horrible about, even, you see some great people and people saying horrible things about them. So you just think you can't please everyone, So what can you do?
What do you think oh, you wish you knew earlier that you know now? So earlier in your career, you wish someone had told you that.
When I started out in journalism, I thought journalists were really cynical, and they are by kind of training. And so when I was kind of 22 and I was in a newsroom, and you would sort of say, "Oh, did you hear this?" And someone would shoot it down with a cynical comment. I'd think, "Oh, I'm so naive," you know. And so I kind of practiced cynicism to sort of try and fit in, you know. So you just want to be like, you know, all of the other journalists, the older journalists. And so I sort of became quite cynical about everything, and to the point now that sometimes I find I'm the cynic, and I think actually it's such a shame. Like, you don't have to be cynical about everything. It's okay to be kind of, you know, a little bit naive and keep your wonder. And because otherwise, you know, very quickly, especially in the news environment, your cynicism catches up with you. And there is so much bad news in the world that we cover in the news sphere. And you can just feel really, really down and depressed about it. So I think it's okay to be a little bit green when you come into the news business, and don't get too cynical too quickly, I think.
Great advice. I agree with you. I think we just become really cynical. And in some ways, it might help in the job in that we ask questions and dig and dig and dig and don't
Right,
take anything at face value, right? But at the same
exactly.
time, yes, it's a bit negative, a bit of a negative
It's like
cycle.
you look up one day and suddenly, you know, you've been in this industry for 15 years and you're just cynical about everything. And it's a shame, you know? So,
Yeah, I'm going to take that advice. And
yeah.
what would you tell people who want to become journalists, foreign correspondents, news presenters? I know it's a very broad question to say what advice would you give? But yeah, if someone came up to you and said, "I really want to do what you do," what would you say?
I mean, I think it's a really shifting landscape. So, you know, sometimes I sort of think, would I tell people to go into it, right? Because it's precarious. Um, you have to be brave and know that there will be ups and downs with it. I think actually, to be honest, the best piece of advice I'd give somebody is, if you can, hang on. If you know that you really want to do this, just keep doing it. Like, even though, you know, there are those moments when, you know, there are job losses, and I know that, you know, economically that's not always possible for people. But I do think by kind of hanging in there and doing kind of whatever journalism you can, I think that you can continue to make a career through it. I think some people get a little bit put off in the beginning when it's quite tough. And I think a lot of people leave sort of that bit, but I think it does get, I wouldn't say easier, but you kind of develop that gut instinct for it. And, you know, it's such a great job in terms of, you know, you'll never be bored. That's what I love about it. You know, you just, every day is interesting and nourishing and intellectually stimulating. And that is a huge privilege. So just hang on, I would say.
Yeah, and with the shifting landscape, artificial intelligence and everything, the way
Right.
we do things, they're changing. The skill set that's needed to do this job, they're changing. Um, what is the future of journalism that you see? I imagine being in a newsroom, you're starting to see these changes creeping into the workflow. Is there going to be a need for us, or what kind of journalists would be needed in the future? What do you think?
So the cynical side of me is incredibly worried about this right now. And, you know, I don't rule anything out. You know, I really think that, you know, the landscape is such that with these kind of margins that people seem to be demanding, you know, I'm really thinking, am I going to be still reading the news? And I'm preparing myself for a life beyond that. But what I will say, and the thing that I kind of cling to, is that journalism is a very human exercise. And we will never be able to go out and get stories unless somebody has been there speaking to someone, right? Like, they're not going to tell a computer, you know, how they're feeling after, you know, whatever it is, a hurricane or whatever's happened. So in that way, I think kind of really on the ground journalism, I think, is probably quite safe, because, you know, you can't get those stories unless someone's gone out and got them. And just kind of from my straw poll on X, most people say that they do want somebody to relay the news to them. It's just, it feels really strange to think it would be a computer doing it. So that's what I'm hoping. And, keeping my fingers crossed. But I do think that it's going to be an insane 10 years that we're living through. I just think that after, this decade, I don't think the industry will barely recognize it. I think somebody was saying that they were thinking it was the biggest kind of decade shift that we'd seen since the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's probably
Yes.
the
I
case.
use AI in the newsroom every day,
Yeah.
and we use it as part of the
Wow.
workflow.
Yeah.
It has helped efficiency, but yeah, it's changed the way we do things. It's pretty incredible.
Mhm.
And you said that you were preparing for life after news. How far along are you in that? And is it just in case I get tired of it, or do you actually see coming full circle one day when you say, okay, I think I've done what I wanted to do in this industry?
I'm not preparing for it in an active way because you just don't have time, right? I wish I did, but there's other things I would love to do in life. I would love, but they're not probably very realistic. I'd love to be kind of writing books, but I'm definitely not in that position to be doing that right now. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of hang on. I'm going to take my own advice, hang on, keep showing up to work, and hope that, if and when the time comes, that I'll kind of know that that's the moment to sort of make the exit. But as you say, it's about kind of making sure that you're not so cynical that, you don't enjoy that anymore. I still really do enjoy it, but I don't want to get to that stage where, you've kind of lost the passion for it and the drive.
Yeah. Okay. And one piece of life advice that you can give?
Oh, wow. It's a really kind of tacky quote that I think I saw on Instagram.
I love
I've always
tacky
liked. And, it's one of those. It's one of those kind of Insta slates, and I think it says a ship in the safe. No, a ship is safe in the harbour, but that's not what ships are built for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been, I just think, it's such a good piece of advice. Go after things, be brave. That's how you grow. That's how you'll find other things. Kind of take those risks. That'll be the most exciting part. Sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable. Sometimes you don't feel that safe. But I think that's what we're here for, right? That's what I think anyway. Have an adventure if you can.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Helena, for your time.
Thank you so much. Really nice to talk to you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating so others can find the podcast. Thank you for your company and see you next time.